Russia has made a decision that is paralyzing American military logistics and redefining the balance of power in the Arctic. On December 28th, Moscow issued a sweeping directive that effectively closes critical airspace corridors to United States military and commercial aircraft. This isn't a temporary restriction or a symbolic protest. Russian authorities have implemented hard closures over vast swaths of airspace that American forces have relied on for decades to project power across the Northern Hemisphere. What's happening behind this decision goes far beyond a simple diplomatic spat. This move fundamentally disrupts American strategic mobility for operations spanning from Europe to Asia, and it comes at a moment when Washington is already stretched thin across multiple theaters. The implications ripple through every aspect of American military readiness, from troop rotations to emergency response capabilities. You might be asking yourself why Russia would take such a drastic step now, and more importantly, why the mainstream media is downplaying the severity of this crisis. The official narrative suggests this is merely retaliation for Western sanctions, a tit-for-tat move that will blow over. But the reality is far more calculated and far more dangerous. This airspace closure reveals a strategic shift that has been years in the making, one that exposes vulnerabilities in American global power projection that military planners hoped would never be tested. But first, we need to understand how the United States built a system of aerial dominance that Russia is now systematically dismantling. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we must go back to the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States didn't just win an ideological victory. Washington secured something far more valuable: unrestricted access to global commons, including airspace that had been contested for half a century. The Arctic routes stretching over Russian territory became critical highways for American military and commercial aviation. These weren't just convenient shortcuts. They were strategic arteries that allowed the Pentagon to move personnel, equipment, and supplies between North America, Europe, and Asia with unprecedented speed. A flight from Alaska to Germany could shave off thousands of miles and precious hours by crossing Russian airspace instead of taking southern routes. For the United States Air Force and commercial carriers supporting military contracts, this access was foundational to operational planning. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Russia was in no position to challenge this arrangement. The country was economically devastated, politically chaotic, and militarily weakened. Russian leaders grudgingly accepted American dominance in exchange for economic aid and the promise of integration into Western institutions. The United States and NATO expanded eastward during this period, bringing former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact nations into the Western Alliance. American military bases proliferated across Eastern Europe. Missile defense systems were deployed in Poland and Romania. NATO conducted exercises on Russia's doorstep. All of this was facilitated by the assumption that Russian airspace would remain open, that Moscow had no choice but to accommodate American strategic needs. Washington took this access for granted, building entire operational doctrines around the assumption that the northern routes would always be available. The financial architecture reinforced this relationship. Russia needed Western investment and technology. American and European corporations moved into Russian energy markets. The Russian economy became increasingly dependent on oil and gas exports denominated in dollars and euros. This economic interdependence was supposed to guarantee stability and cooperation. Western analysts convinced themselves that Russia had been successfully integrated into a rules-based international order where military confrontation was obsolete. The Pentagon continued to use Russian airspace for routine operations, including supply runs to Afghanistan, troop rotations in Europe, and intelligence missions in the Pacific. Moscow issued overflight permits with minimal friction because the economic and diplomatic costs of refusal seemed too high. But something changed. Around 2014, the cracks in this system became impossible to ignore. The crisis in Ukraine marked a turning point when Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatists in eastern Ukraine. The West responded with economic sanctions. These weren't symbolic measures. They targeted Russian banks, energy companies, and key individuals in Putin's inner circle. The sanctions were designed to inflict pain and force Moscow to reverse course. Instead, they accelerated Russian strategic reorientation. Putin's government began building alternative financial systems, reducing dependence on Western technology and strengthening partnerships with China and other non-Western powers. The Russian military underwent comprehensive modernization. Defense spending increased. New weapon systems were developed and deployed. Moscow began asserting itself in Syria, Libya, and other theaters where American influence had previously gone unchallenged. For decades, this system seemed unshakable. But something changed. The assumption that Russia would remain weak and compliant began to crumble. Energy prices rose, filling Russian coffers. China emerged as a strategic partner willing to provide economic support and political backing. The European Union's dependence on Russian natural gas gave Moscow leverage that Western sanctions couldn't neutralize. Most importantly, Russian leadership concluded that integration into the Western order was neither possible nor desirable. Putin and his advisors adopted a confrontational posture rooted in the belief that the United States would never accept Russia as an equal partner. They saw NATO expansion, missile defense systems, and regime change operations in neighboring countries as existential threats. The response was a comprehensive strategy to challenge American primacy wherever possible, using every tool available, from military force to energy politics to information warfare. Airspace access was always going to become a weapon in this struggle. The only question was when Moscow would decide the moment was right to pull the trigger. Now let's examine exactly what happened and why the timing reveals a sophisticated strategic calculation. On December 28th, the Russian Federal Air Transport Agency, operating under direct orders from the Kremlin, issued notice to airmen that designated vast portions of Russian airspace as restricted zones for United States registered aircraft. The official justification cited security concerns and the need to protect Russian territorial integrity. But the technical details tell a more revealing story. The closures specifically target high-altitude corridors used by military transport aircraft, refueling tankers, and reconnaissance platforms. These aren't minor regional restrictions. We're talking about airspace covering millions of square miles across Siberia and the Russian Far East. American aircraft now face a choice: take longer, more expensive southern routes that add hours and fuel costs to every mission, or violate Russian airspace and risk interception. The immediate operational impact is staggering. Consider the logistical chain that supports American forces in Europe. Thousands of flights annually move troops, equipment, and supplies from bases in the continental United States to forward positions in Germany, Poland, and the Baltics. Many of these flights traditionally crossed Russian airspace, shaving 2 to 3 hours off journey times. Those hours matter when you're rotating combat units or responding to a crisis. Now, those flights must reroute south through Mediterranean corridors or north through more challenging Arctic routes that require additional refueling stops. The United States Transportation Command has already acknowledged delays in scheduled rotations. Cargo planes that normally make direct runs from Dover Air Force Base to Ramstein Air Base in Germany now require an extra refueling stop either in the UK or Iceland. This doesn't just slow things down. It increases the number of aircraft and tankers needed to maintain the same operational tempo. In military logistics, this is called friction, and it degrades combat effectiveness. The economic dimension compounds the operational problems. American commercial carriers that hold military contracts are hit even harder. Companies like Atlas Air and Kalitta Air operate fleets of cargo aircraft that ferry everything from spare parts to humanitarian supplies under Pentagon contracts. These companies relied on Russian overflight permits to remain competitive and profitable. Rerouting adds fuel costs, crew expenses, and aircraft wear. Some routes become economically unviable, forcing the Pentagon to either pay premium rates or find alternative contractors who can absorb the costs. The Russian government knows exactly what it's doing here. They're imposing a tax on American global military presence, forcing Washington to spend more money and more resources to achieve the same outcomes over the course of a year. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in additional costs, aircraft depreciation, and operational degradation. But the strategic motivations go deeper than economics or even military logistics. Russia is sending a message about sovereignty and the limits of American power. For 3 decades, Moscow watched as Washington treated the world as an open playground for military operations. American aircraft flew wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, with minimal regard for the concerns of other major powers. Russia had to swallow its pride and accept this reality because it lacked the strength to do otherwise. Now the situation has changed. Russian air defense systems are among the most sophisticated in the world. The 400 and 500 platforms can track and engage targets at extreme ranges. Moscow has the capability to enforce airspace restrictions with lethal force if necessary. By closing these corridors, Russia is demonstrating that it no longer accepts American exceptionalism. The unipolar moment is over. If the United States wants access to Russian airspace, it will have to negotiate as an equal, not dictate terms as a hegemon. The timing coincides with several other pressure points in the relationship. NATO continues to expand its presence in Eastern Europe. The conflict in Ukraine grinds on with Western weapons flowing to Kyiv. Economic sanctions remain in place despite their failure to change Russian behavior. From Moscow's perspective, there's no incentive to continue accommodating American military logistics while Washington actively works to undermine Russian security interests. The airspace closure is leverage. It's a bargaining chip that can be lifted or tightened depending on how negotiations unfold over the broader geopolitical landscape. If the United States wants to restore access, Moscow will demand concessions on sanctions, NATO expansion, or Ukraine. Putin's government has made the calculation that the costs of American retaliation are outweighed by the benefits of asserting control over Russian sovereign territory. What traditional media is not reporting is the coordination behind this move. Russia didn't wake up one morning and decide to close its airspace on impulse. This was planned and synchronized with other actions across multiple domains. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, Russian officials held high-level consultations with Chinese counterparts. Beijing has its own grievances with American military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. Chinese leaders watch closely to see if Russia would actually pull the trigger on airspace restrictions because it sets a precedent. If Russia can successfully defy American aerial dominance without facing crippling consequences, other countries will take note. Iran, North Korea, even nominally neutral states might reconsider their own airspace policies toward American military aircraft. This is about building a coalition of resistance to American global power projection. Behind the scenes, Russian energy companies have been securing long-term contracts with Asian buyers, reducing dependence on European markets that remain subject to Western political pressure. Moscow has also accelerated efforts to create alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar-dominated financial infrastructure. The airspace closure is part of a comprehensive strategy to decouple from Western systems and build a parallel international order. Russian military exercises in the Arctic have intensified over the past year. New bases have been established on remote islands. Icebreakers and submarines patrol waters that were once considered American-dominated. The Arctic is emerging as a critical theater of great power competition, and control over airspace is central to military operations in that environment. Russia is not just closing doors, it's opening new ones with partners who share its vision of a multipolar world. There are also indications that Russia is testing American resolve and response capabilities. How will Washington react? Will the Pentagon attempt to violate the restrictions and dare Moscow to respond? Will the United States escalate with additional sanctions or military posturing? Or will American officials quietly negotiate for limited access while claiming victory in public statements? Russian intelligence agencies are closely monitoring American decision-making processes, looking for signs of weakness or indecision. Every data point feeds into Moscow's assessment of how far it can push before triggering a response that crosses Russian red lines. This is not a static situation. It's a dynamic chess match where each side probes for advantage while trying to avoid catastrophic miscalculation. The mainstream media narrative frames this as a petty retaliation, a nuisance that America can easily overcome by rerouting flights. But that narrative ignores the cumulative effect of dozens of similar moves across multiple domains. Russia restricts airspace. China increases military pressure on Taiwan. Iran threatens shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf. North Korea tests missiles. Each individual action seems manageable, but together they force the United States to spread resources and attention across an expanding list of challenges. The Pentagon calls this multi-domain operations in reverse. Instead of America projecting power simultaneously across land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace, adversaries are forcing the United States to defend simultaneously across all domains. The airspace closure is one piece of a larger mosaic designed to overextend and exhaust American military capabilities. What comes next is crucial. The Pentagon has already begun adjusting flight plans and reallocating resources to compensate for the closures. But these are short-term fixes that don't address the underlying strategic problem. The United States built its global military posture on assumptions that no longer hold. The assumption that adversaries would remain weak or intimidated. The assumption that economic interdependence would prevent confrontation. The assumption that military superiority alone could deter challenges. All of these assumptions are being tested, and the airspace closure is a vivid example of how fragile American advantages really are. The question isn't whether Russia can sustain this policy. The question is whether the United States can sustain its global commitments in an environment where access is contested and costs are rising. At this point, I need to step back from emotion and look at this through a realist lens. In international relations, there's a well-established framework that explains exactly why this unfolded the way it did. Power dynamics between states are not driven by moral considerations or abstract principles. They're driven by security, survival, and the relentless pursuit of advantage in an anarchic system where no higher authority enforces rules. Russia's decision to close airspace is not irrational or reckless. It's a calculated move by a major power that perceives its security interests as threatened and possesses the capability to impose costs on a rival. The logic is straightforward. When a powerful state enjoys unchallenged dominance, it structures the international system to maximize its own freedom of action while constraining rivals. The United States did exactly this after the Cold War. NATO expansion, military bases encircling adversaries, unrestricted overflight rights, and economic sanctions were all tools to maintain American primacy. Russia accepted this arrangement as long as it lacked the strength to resist. But power is never static. As Russia recovered economically and rebuilt its military, the cost-benefit calculation changed. Why should Moscow continue to facilitate American power projection when that power is used to undermine Russian interests? From a realist perspective, the mistake was believing that Russia would remain indefinitely weak or that integration into Western institutions would pacify Russian ambitions. Great powers don't accept subordinate status unless forced to by overwhelming material disadvantage. Once Russia regained sufficient strength, reassertion was inevitable. The airspace closure is a manifestation of this dynamic. It's Russia testing the limits of American power and signaling that it will no longer subsidize American global dominance by providing free access to its territory. The United States faces a choice: escalate and risk broader conflict, or accept that some of its Cold War advantages are gone and adjust strategy accordingly. This framework also explains why negotiations will be difficult. Both sides have legitimate security concerns that are fundamentally incompatible. The United States needs airspace access to maintain its alliance commitments and global military presence. Russia needs to prevent NATO from advancing further and to secure buffer zones along its borders. These are zero-sum issues where one side's gain is the other side's loss. Compromise requires both parties to make painful concessions, and neither is in a position where it feels compelled to back down. The result is a prolonged standoff where tactical adjustments happen, but the underlying strategic competition continues. It's also important to recognize that this is not about good guys versus bad guys. It's about power and security in a competitive international system. The United States would do the same thing if positions were reversed. In fact, Washington has done exactly this by restricting access to American airspace for aircraft from adversarial nations and imposing sanctions that limit their economic and military options. Russia is simply mirroring tactics that the United States pioneered. The difference is that American actions are framed as defending the rules-based order, while Russian actions are framed as aggression. But from a realist standpoint, both are examples of great powers using available tools to advance their interests and constrain rivals. The key takeaway is that this situation was almost inevitable once Russia recovered sufficient capacity and concluded that cooperation with the West was a dead end. The specific trigger might have been Ukraine, sanctions, or NATO expansion, but some form of confrontation was baked into the structural dynamics. Great powers compete. They seek to expand their influence and limit the influence of rivals. They use geography, military force, economic leverage, and legal mechanisms to impose costs on adversaries. The airspace closure fits perfectly within this pattern. It's not an aberration or a temporary tantrum. It's a feature of the emerging multipolar order where multiple powerful states contest for advantage and no single actor can impose its will without resistance. This isn't just about Russia. The consequences will affect the entire architecture of American military strategy and global alliances. Let's start with the immediate personal impact. Energy prices are already climbing in response to heightened tensions. When Russia flexes its geopolitical muscle, oil and gas markets react. The additional costs imposed on military logistics will eventually filter down to taxpayers. The Pentagon will request larger budgets to cover increased operational expenses. That means either higher taxes or cuts to domestic programs. For the average American, this move translates into more expensive fuel, higher inflation, and a government that spends more on defense while struggling to maintain infrastructure and social services. For the entire region, this move fundamentally alters the security landscape. European NATO members are acutely aware that their security depends on rapid American reinforcement in a crisis. The ability to fly troops and equipment directly across Russian airspace was a key component of contingency planning. Now, those plans are obsolete. European militaries will need to invest in their own strategic airlift capabilities or accept longer response times. This creates pressure on alliance cohesion if European countries conclude that American security guarantees are less reliable. They may pursue independent defense strategies or even seek accommodation with Russia. Germany, France, and Italy all have significant economic ties to Moscow. If defending those ties becomes more attractive than relying on a distant American protector whose logistical chains are breaking down, the entire NATO structure could begin to fracture. The international financial system faces another stress test. Russia's willingness to escalate despite sanctions demonstrates that economic coercion has limits. Other countries are watching and learning. If sanctions can't prevent Russia from taking aggressive actions, why should smaller states fear American economic pressure? The dollar's dominance as the global reserve currency depends partly on the perception that the United States has the power to enforce compliance. Every successful act of defiance chips away at that perception. Central banks in China, India, Brazil, and other major economies are already diversifying away from dollar reserves. The airspace closure adds to the narrative that American power is waning and that alternatives must be developed. Over time, this could erode the financial leverage that has been one of Washington's most potent tools. In the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see a cascade of similar moves by other countries emboldened by Russia's example. China will likely impose stricter controls on airspace over the South China Sea and East China Sea, complicating American operations in the Pacific. Iran could close critical airspace over its territory, forcing American and allied aircraft to take longer routes around the Persian Gulf. Even countries that are not overtly hostile might demand higher fees or more restrictive conditions for overflight rights, knowing that the United States has fewer alternatives. The cumulative effect will be a steady degradation of American strategic mobility. The ability to rapidly deploy forces anywhere in the world, which has been a cornerstone of American military doctrine since World War II, will become slower, more expensive, and more uncertain. This also has profound implications for the defense industrial base. Aerospace companies that build military transport aircraft will face demand for new platforms optimized for longer routes and more challenging operating environments. Tanker aircraft that refuel planes mid-flight will become even more critical, driving contracts for next-generation aerial refueling systems. But all of this takes time and money. The defense budget is already stretched across modernization programs, personnel costs, and maintenance of aging equipment. Adding requirements for new airlift and tanker fleets will force painful trade-offs. Some programs will be delayed or canceled. Others will proceed, but at the cost of readiness in other areas. Meanwhile, Russia and China will continue investing in air defense systems designed to deny access and complicate American operations. The long-term strategic picture is one of declining American freedom of action in an increasingly multipolar world. For decades, Washington enjoyed the luxury of operating with minimal constraints. That era is ending. Every military operation will require more careful planning, more resources, and more political capital to execute. Allies will demand more consultation and more burden sharing. Adversaries will test American resolve in multiple locations simultaneously, betting that the United States cannot respond effectively to all challenges at once. This doesn't mean American collapse or irrelevance. The United States still possesses enormous economic and military power, but that power will be less decisive and more contested. The margin for error shrinks. The costs of maintaining global commitments rise, and the risk of miscalculation increases as multiple crises overlap and compete for attention. Russia has demonstrated that strategic patience and calculated risk-taking can impose meaningful costs on even the world's most powerful military. What we're witnessing is not a temporary irritation that diplomacy will quickly resolve, but a fundamental reordering of the assumptions that have governed international security for 3 decades. When a major power concludes that accommodation no longer serves its interests and possesses the capability to act on that conclusion, the international system adapts. States adjust their strategies based on new realities. The closure of Russian airspace to American military aircraft is one of those new realities. This move marks a turning point in the post-Cold War era. It signals that the period of unchallenged American dominance is definitively over. Russia, with Chinese backing and a growing coalition of states frustrated by Western policies, is constructing a parallel order based on sovereignty, multipolarity, and resistance to hegemony. The United States can either accept this new landscape and adjust its strategy accordingly, or it can attempt to restore the old order through escalation and confrontation. The first path requires humility and realism. The second path risks conflicts that no one can fully control. The decisions made in Washington over the coming months will determine which direction the world takes. The unipolar world is fragmenting, and Russia is positioning itself as a central architect of the emerging multipolar reality. Other nations are watching closely, calculating their own moves based on whether Moscow succeeds or fails. If Russia can close its airspace, restrict American military mobility, and avoid devastating consequences, the lesson will be clear. American power can be challenged, contested, and constrained by states with sufficient resolve and capability. That lesson will reshape international politics for decades to come. The question is no longer whether the world will become multipolar. The question is how violently that transition unfolds and whether the existing powers can manage the shift without catastrophic conflict. The closure of Russian airspace to American aircraft is a harbinger of the struggles ahead.